Yesterday, I posted a video about some dietary changes that God led me to, and I talked a little bit about the reactions that I have had to different foods, particularly to flours and whole wheat flours. Honestly, it has been to like any kind of flour. I've had a reaction. So some of the reactions that I've had: increased coughing, rashes, thinning of my skin, neuropathy. So I'm not saying this is a diagnosis. What I'm saying it as is in order to be descriptive about symptoms. This is not a diagnosis. This is a signal that something's wrong. What are being called diagnoses right now are either going to be spirits, or it's going to be that you're doing something in opposition to your design. So let me describe the symptoms of that. Pain in my muscles, flu-like aching in my body, numbness, weakness. That's what happens to me when I eat store-bought bread and flours. If I drink milk or have a milk product, I'll get increased coughing, phlegm, digestive upset. Oh, I'll get that with the grains as well. So a lot of like bloating and intense pain in my stomach. Again, with the milk, thin skin, rashes, earaches. So it doesn't make it very worth it to me to eat these foods. But the word tells me that in the end times, people are going to be told not to eat certain foods. But food has been provided to be received in thanksgiving. We just need to eat it in accordance with our design and the way that God intended for us to eat. He did not intend for us to eat a bunch of processed foods and dead foods. There are ways that He established for us to eat. And it is not, I want to tell you, my only reluctance to doing these videos is that I don't want people to start thinking of food as quote unquote medicine. I don't want them to think of food as just being, oh, this is just about a dietary change. God has used food repeatedly. Food, working the land, working our food, like working leaven into a batch of dough. He's used these things in order for us to understand His symbolism. So if you miss the symbolism, you've missed the point. And congratulations, you've received your reward here, because all you did was make dietary changes. And I want to be honest with you, I believe that that's very wicked. If you do these things, make these changes, lean into the metaphor that God has established with regard to good wine or bad wine, or receiving your daily bread, or working yeast into the dough. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman worked into a batch of dough. So now you understand your covenant. You keep working that, and it's going to grow into this beautiful, delicious loaf of bread, this beautiful, delicious kingdom. Please don't let that be lost on you. That's my only reluctance to talking about food and giving you these tips that I've learned with Him is I just don't want anyone to mistake my intentions of teaching this to you. Your body, the way that God has designed us, is to receive food in the manner in which God created it. All of these alterations that we've made with our food, the lack of relationship that we have with our food, even animals are supposed to be slaughtered in a particular way. All the blood is immediately supposed to be drained. Otherwise, it starts going into different parts of the body, and it's impossible to fully drain that out. The word tells us that. One of the commands that Paul gave people was, specifically the Gentiles, was do not eat food or do not eat meat with blood in it. Personally, I shop for my meat at halal markets. I do not go to kosher markets because of the additions to the scroll that Judaism, as it stands today, not true Judaism, but Reformed Judaism, because of the additions that they've made. God didn't say soak your meat in salt water, for example, which is something that kosher does. So I choose to go to halal markets, and that's where I get my meat. It does cook up a little bit differently, slightly differently. You have an animal that's been treated well in its lifetime, it's not going to have as much fat. It's been eating well, it's been roaming, it's going to be leaner meat. And so for some things, you might need to add a little bit of fat. It's not that complicated, like it's not that big of a deal, to be honest. I like a little bit more fat in my burger, so I'll add a little bit of olive oil to the pan or some homemade ghee. and I'm good to go. So let me talk a little bit in this video about some of the basics that I've made, and I want to talk about bread making, because the thing that I talked with you about in the other video is that I used to have these really bad, or I do have these really bad reactions when I'm eating dead food. And so I thought for a while, I was like, okay, I guess God just doesn't want me to eat bread and he doesn't want me to drink milk. All right, well, then I won't do these things. I'm still a little reluctant to drink milk, but I will tell you a couple things I do. I make my own yogurt. It's super easy to do. I find a good quality milk, grass-fed, whole milk, unpasteurized if you can. Do not ever buy ultra pasteurized. It kills everything in the milk. Everything good, the good proteins, you're losing everything that's good in that milk. Here where I live, if I go to like the local Ralph's or something, they have Horizon, the brand Horizon. So that's usually what I end up buying. Horizon, full fat, grass-fed, organic. They only sell it in the half carton. It's probably about $7 for the half carton, but I get my money's worth out of it. So I make my yogurt in the Instant Pot. Find a good quality yogurt for your starter, and you'll never have to buy yogurt again. The yogurt that I buy, I get from the halal market. It's an Indian yogurt, and it's called Gopi, Gopi. I pour that half gallon in the Instant Pot. I put maybe 2 to 3 tablespoons of Gopi yogurt, and I stir it in. Again, this is the last time you'll ever have to buy yogurt. You might be tempted to put in more. You don't need to put in more. Stir it into the milk. Set it to the boil setting, so on yogurt, so you will press the yogurt button twice, and it should go to boil. So you let it boil. When it gets done, it's not going to be like a rolling boil, by the way. It's going to be a yogurt boil, so it's going to keep it. The nice thing about using an Instant Pot is it keeps it at a certain temperature, whereas if you're doing this over the stove, you're going to have, use a meat thermometer or something like that in order to keep it at a certain temperature. I don't know how to do that, but you could easily look it up online since I use my Instant Pot. And then you're going to need to play around with the settings to get your yogurt onto it has like a low, medium, and high setting on the yogurt. And so you're going to need to play around with your settings to get the yogurt on. I would do about 12 hours. You could do 24. It's basically going to keep the yogurt at a particular temperature, and the cultures are going to work their way into that milk, and when it's done, you're just going to have yogurt. I usually get about 2 32-ounce mason jars of yogurt out of that. You can make cream cheese, supposedly, although I've never actually made cream cheese out of it. It ends up being more of a labneh, which is like a yogurt cheese, so it doesn't quite have that consistency. It's like between a cream cheese and a yogurt. It's really good. You can put olive oil on it, mix some dill, a little salt, something called za'atar. If you go to an Arabic market or a halal market, they should have that. You can put it on your breads. You can eat it with flatbread. It's really delicious. And the way that you get that cheese is simply by, get a bowl, put a strainer over it, set a little cheesecloth, about 4 layers of cheesecloth inside that strainer, pour some yogurt inside of it, fold up the cheesecloth over it, and let it drain in your refrigerator overnight. When you open it up, you're going to have cheese, that yogurt type cheese. And it's really delicious, and you can use whatever whey has separated, whatever whey has drained off. You can use that in all kinds of recipes. It's a good protein. You can use it. I don't think I would necessarily use it in soups, although I've heard people talk about that. Personally, I wouldn't like the tanginess in my soup, although I did make Jeremiah some lentils the other day with it, and it was quite good. But you can use it in baking and things like that. You can also use it in your sourdough starter, actually. Okay, so in terms of bread making, I talked about the reactions I've had. The reason I'm having reactions, because I experimented with this. Okay, do I need to buy different flours and things like that? I mill my own berries. No, I don't have a mill, so when I mill my wheat berries, and again, I'll buy wheat berries such as einkorn, ancient grains, einkorn, emmer, spelt. I have some regular wheat berries. I don't even know what kind of wheat they are, but I had ordered them a while ago, so I mixed those into my, jar of, I have a giant jar of wheat berries with einkorn in it. I have a Ninja, and so with the Ninja, it has a little cup attachment, And the cup, like for smoothies and things like that, with the cup attachment, I get a finer grind than I would with the blender or the food processor. So it's plenty large for me to mill my grain or grind my grain that I'm going to use for my bread. And I do that fresh every time I'm going to make a loaf of bread. And don't forget to use some of it, set aside part of it for your starter. I don't like having a bunch of gadgets in my kitchen. It's like, who has space for that? It's just annoying. I have not found my blades to dole out, but I mean, I regularly will take ice from the freezer and you just sharpen your blades up by grinding ice. Now, God did not intend for us to be buying packets of yeast from the grocery store. So I've baked bread for a long time and I've used those packets of yeast and they are absolute garbage. You're not getting anything from those packets of yeast, but you do get certain benefits from having your own fermented yeast, from making your own fermented yeast. No one in biblical times had packets of yeast from Ralph's. They were making their own yeast. The other thing that they didn't do is they did not throw out their discard from their yeast starter. They wouldn't have been doing this every day because where would they have kept it? But I'll tell you that one of the things about this was never like an issue of the flours or anything like that. It's an issue of the yeast for me because I eat bread every single day, bread that I bake from my yeast starter, and I do not have any of the problems that I've had. In fact, my stomach has gone flat. I don't have the heaviness, I don't have the bloating, I don't have any of it, and I actually feel really good, like my body feels good on this. I do recommend using ancient grains, buying your own berries, and milling your own grain. What that fermented yeast does is it replenishes good bacteria in your body. So it's good for your gut versus the store-bought breads, which are terrible for your gut. Again, are we talking about medicine? No, we're not talking about medicine. If you have a major issue, you need to go to God. You need to return to Him and find out what is going on with what's going on here. Is this an issue of Him dealing with you on sin, or is this an issue of you sinning against your own body by doing things that are in opposition to how He has designed you? If you're eating poison and I tell you stop eating poison and eat this thing that's good for your body, that's in line with how God created you, I haven't just told you to eat medicine. I've told you, stop doing that stupid thing, and here, do something that's wise. That's what I'm advocating here. I'm not advocating medicine. And it becomes a problem when we start using that language and those concepts because we are encouraging and feeding this idea that we need medicine in order to heal. The word says God is our healer and He won't put on us any diseases that He put on the Egyptians. So if you have these issues, that's the reason why. Because you have not obeyed Him. If you are having major diseases, you need to return to God. Okay, so I want to talk with you about this bread and how to make your own starter. And the reason I talked about the yogurt is because I use the yogurt in my bread and I use it in my starter. And by the way, eating my yogurt that I make, I don't have any of the problems that I have had eating dairy. We don't have gluten intolerance. We don't have lactose intolerance. What we have is an issue of the food industry being corrupt and Satan attacking something that God actually wants us to understand. He wants us to relate with our food. He wants us to relate with animals so that we're giving them a humane life, caring for them, and giving them a humane death, not packing them into slaughterhouses and stalls and this sort of thing. We need to be relating with our food. He uses food repeatedly as a metaphor in the Bible. So I don't have these issues with my yogurt. I can eat my yogurt all day. I can eat that cheese and I'm good to go. And it's so good for my stomach. It feels good in my body. It's nutritious. You can tell when you're eating something that is nutritious. Your body knows it. A while ago, I was talking with someone who was telling me that he knows this lady who was eating a biblical diet, quote unquote, biblical diet, and she blew up. And I've never forgotten that he told me about this. But here's the thing, like if you're eating store-bought breads and you're not and those store-bought breads don't have good fermented yeast, which they don't. Well, yeah, you're going to blow up. I mean, the word talks about eating bread a lot, so I'm going to guess that she was eating a lot of bread. Sugar was also not something that people ate in biblical times. Sugar wasn't discovered until about 350 AD. You hear about honey. Honey is totally different. So I'm going to guess that this person really did not understand the way that God has designed us to eat. He's designed us to eat food in its most natural form, not to be processing down food and making synthetic yeasts and, just things like this. Like I told you, I eat bread every single day, and my stomach, I don't have those issues. I'm not gaining weight from bread. As a matter of fact, it goes in the total opposite direction. It has good proteins and is very sustaining. And it's delicious. There's a reason why this was a staple meal. There's also a reason why people were drinking wine and they weren't having problems like we have, like quote unquote alcoholism and things like this. Wine also has a yeast that is made from grapes and is found on the skins of those grapes. Now, I have not gotten into winemaking yet, but that will be the next thing that I do. And it's not going to taste the same as store-bought wines, but I also do not react well to store-bought wines. And I'm sure that it's because of these synthetic yeasts that they're using. It isn't fermented correctly, and so it's not doing what God intended it to do inside of your stomach, inside of your body. And as a matter of fact, if you look at what happens with people who are over drinking, they actually destroy their gut bacteria. Whereas wine that has been properly fermented is going to replenish. And the word talks about everything in moderation, even honey. That a little bit of honey is good, but too much honey is going to be bad. Okay, people make this far too complicated, making a starter. They act like you need some sort of doctorate in starter making, and then they have whole YouTube ministries on starter making, and you're doing this wrong with your starter. Stop doing this. 10 things to know about a starter. I'm going to break it down real simple, because that is for the birds. It almost after watching videos on starter making and reading articles and stuff like that, you almost end up feeling like bread making is impossible, and these people just don't want you to bake bread. It seems like they want you to feel really dependent on them and really scared and reluctant about your starter. Don't worry about these things. I'm going to break it down for you. Get some good quality flour. In fact, I highly recommend that you just get some good quality berries and mill your own grain. When you start your starter, I would take about 2 to 3 tablespoons. People pull out their scales and everything else. I do not pull out a scale when I'm making my starter. All of this is far too much work. They didn't even have things like this kind of technology in biblical times. I don't think that they were pulling out a scale and doing a big old to-do every time they, made their yeast. It's going to take about a week to get your starter going. And what you want to do is keep increasing the strength of your starter. So I'll talk a little bit about that. What I do is I get a mason jar. I get about a 32-ounce mason jar because I want to give room for my starter to rise. So you're going to need 2 32-ounce mason jars, one for your discard, one for your starter. Put about 2 to 3 tablespoons of flour, good quality flour, inside that jar. You need some water that does not have chlorine in it. I hate to say use bottled water because of the plastics that end up in your water. I have a reverse osmosis filter in my sink, so that's the filtered water that I use for my starter. If you got to use bottled water, then that's what you got to do. If you make that yogurt, pour a little bit of that yogurt into the starter. It's going to help to get things going. So I would say maybe a couple tablespoons. Pour these things slowly. You want to get a consistency that's going to be a little drier than what you would eat in your, for oatmeal. Like a thick oatmeal, a little bit drier than that thick oatmeal. Stir it up real good. Place the mason lid on top, but don't screw it in because you need space for this to expand. If you screw on the lid, you're going to end up with an exploded starter at some point when the gases start. what's going to happen is it's going to start smelling like alcohol. Don't freak out about that. You might even think that it smells like acetone. Don't freak out about that. That's the fermentation process. Now, that's not going to happen immediately. It's going to happen probably in a couple days. Keep it on your counter in a semi-warm place. Between your stove and your refrigerator is a good place because you get the heat from the fridge and the heat from the stove. But you don't want to put this in like an oven or something like that because you're going to kill everything. So I have between my stove and my oven, I also have my tea kettle, like an electric tea kettle. So that's like a good warm spot for it. Stir it up, set that little lid on top. Don't screw it in. Tomorrow, you're going to pour a little bit of it out into the discard jar, the other 32-ounce jar. You're going to leave about 1.5 tablespoons of starter left in your starter jar. Some people talk about getting a new jar and doing this every day, getting a new jar and putting it inside. I don't see the need for that. What I do is I just scrape down the sides of my jar. I've got about 1.5 tablespoons of starter left in my jar, and I'm going to increase the strength of my starter by adding another 1 to 2 heaping tablespoons of flour and some water. I'm going to stir it up, put the lid back on top. And as time goes on, what I mean when I say increase the strength of your starter is if you kind of hold your jar to the side, you're going to start seeing that strings, your starter is going to get a little bit more sticky, and you're going to start to see that it attaches to the sides of the jar if you were to hold it sideways. Whereas when you first start out, it might be pretty runny. Okay, so you're mixing it up again. You want the consistency of a little drier than a bowl of oatmeal. And your final product should be about a biscuit size of starter inside of your jar. So once you've added the flour and the water, you should have about a biscuit size of starter in your jar. Put the lid back on. As this starts to ferment, remember that it's going to start expanding. And so eventually you want it to start expanding to about double the size. But it's going to take a little time to get there. So don't worry if it's not doing that. After about a week, you should get some good bubbles in there. I mean, really, after a few days, you should get it. If you are using a good quality, like you started out with a good quality yogurt, you'll probably get it sooner than later. Like you could start seeing that within 2 days. You could see some good bubbles in there. And that's the process. Every day you go to it, it's going to stink. It's going to smell like alcohol. Don't freak out about it. Don't pour it out. I mean, you can pour it out, but I don't see the point in that. It's called hooch. It's not a big deal. It's just alcohol. It's part of the whole fermentation process. Now, with your discard, since you're discarding every day, don't worry about your discard. Don't be like, oh, well, I can't do anything with it. Use that discard. So you're going to keep your discard in the refrigerator, closed up, sealed up. When it comes time for you to make something, whether it's pancakes or biscuits, you can make a flatbread in your, on your stove. So put some oil in a pan. Mix up that starter, add some flour to it, because if you just pour starter, it's going to be really, really sour. Mix up some flour and water in there. Make yourself like a kind of a thinner batter. Pour that into your pan, into a hot oiled pan. You can put some chives, a little bit of garlic. Don't mix it into your dough. Put it on top. Sprinkle it on top. Everything but the bagel seasoning. I like that seasoning on it. And just fry it up. Let it cook for a little while. Get nice and crispy. Flip it over. You can eat that with your labneh, with your yogurt cheese, with some olive oil and balsamic vinegar. It's really delicious. It's a good snack. I mean, sometimes I even eat that for dinner. And again, this is not like, when we're snacking on store-bought bread and we get fat on that. It's not the same thing. This is really good for you. Okay, so how do you use your starter when you go to make bread? I don't ever measure anything out. Like I'm not really, I never really cook that way. I mean, I guess with baking, like you kind of have to measure things out. But honestly, with bread making, I don't really feel like I need to. I know the consistency, like the texture that I'm looking for. So if you're like a recipe person, I have my friend Nancy is a baker, and she has anxiety every time I give her a recipe or teach her how to do something. I'll say, you just have to come over here and learn how to make it. And she hates it because she needs like these measurements. So if you're that kind of a person, I'm sorry, I'm just going to give you anxiety. I cook like my Italian grandma who's like, oh, when it feels like this, when it tastes like this. Okay, so when I make my bread, I have a stand mixer, and so I do my bread in the stand mixer. It's a lot easier to do it that way because it's hard to work with sticky dough, and you don't want to add too much flour to your dough because that's what your bread's gonna end up tasting like. You want like a light, airy dough. So I tend to use my stand mixer. If you're gonna be kneading by hand, then you might want to look up some videos on how to do this. But I know the texture that I'm looking for. I'm looking for kind of a sticky-ish dough. Not a sticky dough, but a sticky-ish dough. So when you're bread making, there's a method that people use called the slap and fold method. And you'll see what they're doing. They're kind of slapping the dough around on a board. If you do it in the stand mixer, don't turn it up too high, turn it on low, and it's basically going to do the same thing. You're going to be kind of slapping and folding it against the sides of the bowl of the stand mixer. So what I do is I take some of my starter. Now, when you're going to use your starter, you want to take it out. It's got to be active, so you want to make sure if it's been in the refrigerator, you're going to feed it. You're going to add a little water and some flour, stir it up, leave it, about 12 hours. I usually take it out before I go to bed at night, and then I'll bake my bread sometime the next day. I'm going to mill my grain, probably about 2 to 3 cups of flour is what I usually use for a loaf of bread. So I pour my starter in first. Again, like about a biscuit size of starter. Sometimes I'll use more. About 2 to 3 cups of flour. I usually pour a little bit of my yogurt in there because I like the way that the yogurt kind of makes a lighter loaf. When you're using ancient grains like einkorn or emmer or spelt, it's going to be a denser loaf in general. And so adding yogurt or even adding a different kind of flour, with it is going to make it a little bit lighter. Then I'll add some molasses or honey. I'll mix it, and as I'm mixing it, I'll add water as needed. I'll get kind of a sticky dough going. And that sticky dough, as you are mixing it on low, is going to become, once the gluten is kind of worked in, strengthened, it's not going to be so sticky. So I'll knead that in the stand mixer for about 10 minutes. And eventually you're going to get a good dough ball going. All right, with an oiled hand, I'll just take the dough off the hook, cover it with a damp towel, and I put the oven light on. Do not turn your oven on. You don't want your flour or your dough to rise too quickly. You just want to put it in a place where there's a little bit of warmth. The warmth of the oven light is perfect. And I put it in the oven for the first rise. It may not fully rise the first time that you do it. Don't worry about that. It will rise on the second rise, so don't panic if it doesn't rise the first time. Okay, so then I'm going to leave it for about 2 to 3 hours. I'm going to come back, knead the dough again. Again, if you're using a stand mixer, do it on low, about 10 minutes. This time when I take it out, I'm going to round it out into a loaf, like an artisan style loaf. I put it into a bread basket. I don't even know how to explain this, but it's called a Banneton proofing basket. So it's kind of got rings around it. Some of them have like a cloth cover. Mine doesn't actually have a cloth cover. I think these are pretty cool actually. The kits that come with like the blades where you can cut. I don't have any of that fancy equipment. I just have the Banneton basket. I use a flour towel. I flour it and I throw the dough in there. Cover it up with a wet towel. Toss it back in the oven with the oven light. And I'm going to let it rise another couple hours. Then I'm going to pull it out and I heat the oven to 550. With my Dutch oven inside of the oven because I want to get it really, really hot and I want to get it steamy. Be careful when you take it out because everything's going to be really hot. Make sure you got your hands covered. Now lower the oven to 485. I don't really like to use parchment paper or things like this, plastic wrap and stuff like that. I don't like to use that often. But in this particular case, I use parchment paper to bake my bread. Okay, so I'm going to dump out the risen loaf onto the parchment paper. I take a pair of kitchen scissors and I cut across the bread and I make like a star pattern then I'll make some other cuts around making a star pattern, but I get one good slice into that dough all the way straight across because you want to give it room for the air to come out and for that loaf to be able to rise. lower it into the Dutch oven, cover the lid, get that back into the oven. Try not to let all of that heat escape out of the oven. What you're doing here by putting it into the Dutch oven and putting the lid on is you're creating steam. So when the steam comes from the bread, it's just going to kind of stay in that Dutch oven and it's going to steam the bread. That's what, in fancy bakeries and stuff like that, that's what they have, are like steam ovens to bake their bread. So that's all you're doing, is creating that effect inside of the Dutch oven. Okay, I set my timer for 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, I turn the oven off and I just let it sit there for a little while. I'm not going to lift the lid. I mean, you can. You're going to be tempted to look at your loaf and stuff like that, but I try to keep all of that heat and that steam in there to continue baking the bread. And I'll let it sit there for about another 5 minutes, and then I'll pull it out of the oven. You don't want to overcook it. If what you want is you want a good crisp on the outside, you could also pull the lid off so that you get that crisp. But at the risk of overcooking it, I would just, the first few times that you do it, just let it be. Let it be like this, and then you can kind of play around with things. And this makes a really tasty bread. Oh, one thing I forgot, I'm so sorry. Salt. Make sure that you salt when you add salt. That was the one thing that I forgot. So when you're adding your, if you add yogurt, the water, honey or molasses, and some salt, like a good bit of salt. Okay, sorry, someone's going to want measurements. Like a couple teaspoons of salt. 1 to 2 teaspoons, depending on how much salt you like. Again, don't be afraid of salt. If you're eating well, if you're eating right, these things aren't going to be a problem. You don't need to use the iodized salt. Use a good quality salt in the way that God intended the salt to be. Okay, back to your starter. So you're going to want to be feeding your starter. You're going to want to strengthen your starter for a good, at least a week. In the beginning, I wasn't really accustomed to eating bread very often, and so I wasn't using my starter. Maybe I would, bake a loaf of bread once a week. Now, to be honest, I use my starter every day, so I keep my starter pretty active. But if you only intend on using your starter once a week or once every 2 weeks or something like that, then you can actually dry your starter out. There's no way that people in biblical times were doing this starter, feeding their starter every day and then discarding and whatever. They were either using it all the time, like probably every day or every other day, like I am doing, or they were drying out their yeast. And so you can dry out your yeast kind of like, what you would get, like if you were to use a packet, you can actually dry it out. So the way that you would do this is you'll just add a bunch of flour to it. Once you have an active, good, strong starter, get it to a really dry consistency. You can even pour loose flour on top of it after you get it to that dry consistency, stirring it up and making sure that it's super, super dry all throughout. Pour a little bit of flour on top, like maybe a tablespoon of flour on top, seal it up and put it in your fridge. And this, you can always reactivate that starter. And again, remember that when you reactivate your starter, what you're doing is you're taking it out. Now you're going to add some water to it, stir it up, get a good, like a dry oatmeal consistency. Set it on the counter. It's going to reactivate. Set it on the counter overnight or whatever. So that's it. Easy peasy. It's not rocket science. This is so good for your body, you guys. I suffered for years and years with these reactions, and it turns out God wants for us to be eating food in the way that He designed it. Go figure. And when we're doing that, our bodies are going to respond favorably because we're actually living within our design. So you can enjoy that bread however you enjoy bread. I mean, we make sandwiches with it. The other day when it was raining outside, I put on a pot of soup and I made veggie sandwiches for us with avocado and peppers and tomatoes and homemade pickles, and they were delicious on that bread. It's going to smell like something from your childhood. Like you're going to remember, oh my goodness, people actually used to cook like this. Like the smell of it actually smells like bread. My daughter and I, I will make it. My daughter likes to say, oh, I want to make this with you. And then when it comes down to make it, she'll like go and do something else. And what it really means is I want you to make it. So I make ghee, homemade ghee, and we slather that on that bread, and it's so, so good. And once you get comfortable with your starter, you can make all kinds of things. You can make your desserts with it, your cobblers, biscuits, flatbread, pancakes, cookies, all kinds of stuff with that starter. I haven't tried this yet, but I intend on trying it. You can make your own crackers with it. All right, so the next thing that I'll be trying is making my own wine, because I just do not react well to the wines in the store. Not that I even need it. I mean, I was perfectly okay with giving up wine, to be honest. But as I started to react favorably to the fermented yeast in this bread, God started to lead me to that scripture where Paul talks about, he's telling Timothy, drink a little bit of wine. Don't just drink water, but drink a little bit of wine for your stomach, for your frequent stomach ailments. Now, what is Paul saying? Is he saying, here's some medicine, take this medicine for your stomach? No, he's just simply telling Timothy, God has designed you to incorporate this into your diet, so do it. Fermented wine, by the way, is not going to taste the same as store-bought wine. It's probably going to have a little bit of a more acidic taste, like more of maybe a vinegar taste, but it's going to be good for your stomach. I don't think anyone would have necessarily been indulging on this kind of wine. I mean, there is evidence in the Bible that people were doing it, but I don't think it would be as easy as with these store-bought spirits and wine. It's going to be a little bit easier to kind of sip on something like that. And it's good for your stomach. The thing about winemaking that I just want to be really careful about is botulism. So I need to make sure that I have the right equipment to make wine. And if I have good results, then I'll share them with you. If anyone else is familiar with winemaking, I'd love to hear your thoughts. The only issue for me is I'm not going to be using sugar in my wine, because they weren't using sugar in their wine. Sugar in the wine raises the alcohol content, so a lot of people are concerned about that, like they want to make sure that they have enough alcohol content. That's not really my concern here. I want to restore back to what God originally created, and I don't hear anyone talking about using honey in the wine or anything like that in the Bible either. So I have a feeling that it's just really making that yeast with the skins of the wine, the skins of the grape, and then fermenting that juice and maybe making some sort of a pumice with the mashed up grapes. So I will keep you guys posted on that. I hope this was a helpful video. Let me know how things turn out for you. Again, one thing I want to encourage you with is your first few loaves, you might even be proud of them and be like, it's not that great of a loaf, but I'm super proud of it because I did it. And that's cool. As time goes on, you're going to get better and better at making the bread and just having a relationship with it. I know that sounds weird, but if you cook, that you do have a relationship with your food. And so as you have a relationship with your food, you're going to know when the dough feels like this or looks like this or, that sort of thing. That's why I don't really use recipes. It's more of like, okay, when it feels like this, when it looks like this, I know it's ready. All right, please feel free to ask questions as you have them, and happy baking.